My name is Marilyn Voss, and at 72 years old, I was the woman everyone assumed had figured it out. Retired after 34 years as a licensed clinical social worker, living alone in a modest ranch house in Dayton, Ohio, growing tomatoes in the backyard and reading library books I'd already read once before. Comfortable, people assumed. Settled. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly selling off pieces of my late husband's coin collection for 3 years to cover the gap between my Social Security check and my property taxes. Not desperately, not dramatically, just steadily, the way you bail water from a boat that's taking on just enough to matter. I didn't talk about it. Talking about money felt like admitting something had gone wrong, and in my family, you didn't admit things had gone wrong. You managed. You adjusted. You kept your face pleasant at Sunday dinners and let other people have the crises. So when my older brother Raymond sat across from me at his 80th birthday dinner and asked me, warm as firelight, whether that monthly arrangement of his was still helping me keep the house, I didn't understand the question. Not at first. I understood it about 4 seconds later, and I understood it so completely that I had to reach under the table and press my palm flat against my own knee to keep my expression from changing. The arrangement, the monthly arrangement he believed had been helping me keep the house. I had no house to keep. I owned my house outright. I had never asked Raymond for a single thing in my entire adult life. And whatever arrangement he was describing, I had never seen $1 of it. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary women stop shrinking to fit into spaces other people designed for them and start taking up exactly the room that was always theirs. I'm Marilyn. This is my story. And if a quiet voice and a very long fuse speak to you, stay with me. The ending earns it. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what happened to me, because the what only makes sense if you understand the who. I spent 34 years listening to other people's worst days for a living. Addiction cases, custody battles, elderly adults whose families had decided for them what their lives should look like. I was good at staying steady while someone else came apart. I was good at hearing the thing beneath the thing a person was saying. I was good at patience so thorough it looked like stillness. What I was not good at was asking for help, or money, or anything that required me to say out loud that I was anything less than fine. My husband Gerald died 11 years ago, a quiet man who taught high school history and collected coins the way other men collect grievances, with real tenderness and attention to detail. We didn't have children. We had each other and our routines and a modest savings account that was perfectly adequate until it met 11 years of inflation and a furnace that died in January and a roof that followed it 18 months later. I wasn't destitute. I want to be clear about that. But I was careful in a way I hadn't expected to be, and there was a low-grade hum of financial anxiety I'd learned to tune out the way you tune out traffic noise outside a window you can't close. Raymond was my only living sibling, 8 years older, successful in the way people of his generation measured success, meaning he'd built something with his own hands, in his case a mid-sized landscaping company he'd sold before his knees gave out. He had money, real money, and he'd always had a generous impulse toward the people he loved. He also had a daughter named Patrice and a son-in-law named Doug. And those two facts, I would come to understand, were the architecture of everything. Patrice was 46, polished in the way that costs money to maintain, and she had appointed herself the manager of Raymond's life after his wife passed 6 years ago. She handled his calendar, his medical appointments, his holiday meals. She'd cultivated the role of devoted daughter with real skill, and Raymond, who missed his wife and was beginning to find certain paperwork confusing, had been grateful for every bit of it. I had never said a word against her. That's important, not because I approved of everything I observed, but because she was his daughter and I was his sister, and I understood the difference. I had no standing to say anything, and so I said nothing. I folded my hands and stayed in my lane and showed up at the dinners she organized and told myself that the faint unease I felt in her presence was probably my own problem. When Raymond asked me about the arrangement at his birthday dinner, Patrice's hand moved immediately to his forearm, light as a moth landing, and the conversation turned, smooth as a skipped stone, toward the centerpiece she'd ordered and whether the caterer had gotten the soup right. I sat there with a fist in my chest, and a question I couldn't ask without sounding like a woman who'd lost the thread of something. Raymond was 80. He was sharp enough, but certain words scattered on him now. I wasn't going to challenge him at his own table on his own birthday over something I didn't yet understand. So I smiled and complimented the soup and drove home in the dark with the radio off. The first letter arrived 4 days later. It was from a financial management firm I'd never heard of, addressed to me in Dayton with language dry enough to sand a floor. It referenced, in the polite bureaucratic way of such documents, the annual gift distributions made on behalf of Mr. Raymond Coulter to his sister, Marilyn Voss. I sat down in my kitchen chair and read it 3 times. The amounts climbed from the earlier years to the more recent ones. The total across the 4 years referenced in the letter was just over $250,000. Give or take, I am a woman who spent 3 decades in the human services field. I do not rattle easily. I sat in that chair for what felt like a long time and did not move. Then I went and got my laptop and pulled up every bank statement I had for the past 4 years and went through them the way I used to go through case files, methodically, no hurry, looking for the thing that was or wasn't there. 2 hours later, I closed the laptop. Not one deposit, not a partial, not an anomaly, nothing. Whatever Raymond had been sending to someone named Marilyn Voss had arrived somewhere that was not my account. I made a cup of tea and sat with the 2 facts that I now held. Fact 1, my brother had been gifting money meant for me for 4 years. Fact 2, I had never received a cent of it. There is a third fact that I didn't name out loud for several days, but that had been sitting in the room with me since the birthday dinner. Raymond had asked about the arrangement with a particular warmth. The warmth of a man who believed he'd been receiving grateful, regular confirmation that his generosity was working, which meant someone had been providing him with that confirmation. In my name. I finished my tea, I washed the cup, I went to bed. I lay in the dark for a while and let myself feel the full size of it before I put it somewhere useful. Because that's the thing no one tells you about being the steady one. You have to feel it first, privately and completely, or it festers somewhere it shouldn't. Then you put it away and you go to work. In the morning I went to work. I called Raymond the next afternoon and kept my voice warm and easy. I told him I was calling to thank him properly for the lovely party. We talked for 15 minutes about nothing of consequence, and then I said, casually, as though it had just crossed my mind, "Raymond, I've been meaning to ask you something. That financial arrangement you mentioned at dinner, could you tell me a little more about how that works exactly? I want to make sure the paperwork on my end is tidy." There was a brief pause on the line. Then his voice changed slightly, not suspicious, puzzled. "Well, I pass it through Patrice," he said simply. "She handles the transfers, handles the thank you notes back to me, keeps everything organized. You know how she is." I said I did. I thanked him and said I'd follow up with Patrice directly. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat with my hands folded and breathed carefully for a moment. He believed Patrice handled the transfers. He believed the thank you notes came from me. He had been for 4 years receiving correspondence that led him to believe his sister was grateful and comfortable and taken care of. I thought about what she must have written in those notes, what voice she'd constructed for me. Whether she'd been careful or careless, whether she'd fabricated details of my life, whether she'd signed my name in her own hand or had it typed and thought no one would ever compare. I thought about Raymond carrying those letters around because Raymond was the kind of man who kept things, his wife's grocery lists, his son's first-grade drawings. He was a keeper of evidence of love. The thought of her writing to him as me made something very cold move through my chest. I let it move through. Then I picked up the phone and called a legal aid line a colleague had mentioned to me 2 years ago in a context neither of us had expected would become relevant. The attorney I eventually reached was a woman named Beverly Crane, and she had the voice of someone who had heard a great many things and stopped being surprised by any of them. She listened to my story from beginning to end without interruption, asked 4 precise questions, and then explained to me very carefully the shape of the wall I was standing against. "The checks are your brother's," she said. "Legally, he's the payer. You're the named payee. But if someone else endorsed your name on the back and deposited those checks into their own account, the fraud lives on that endorsement. The front of the check looks perfectly legitimate. Banks process it without a second thought. The crime is on the back. And to see the back, I said I need. You need Raymond, she said. As the check writer, he has standing to authorize the bank to release the endorsement images. You don't. Not without a court order. And that takes time you may not want to spend. I understood. Every road led through Raymond. And between me and Raymond sat Patrice, 4 years deep in a role she'd built specifically to stand there. Beverly was quiet for a moment, then added the part that changed the pitch of the whole conversation. I want you to understand what you may be looking at, Marilyn. If your name was signed by another person's hand to cash checks belonging to you, that's forgery under Ohio statute. Depending on what else was done in your name, the correspondence, for instance, this can rise to a pattern of deception that prosecutors take seriously. I thanked her. I made a follow-up appointment. I drove to the library afterward and sat in the periodicals section for 20 minutes not reading anything, which is something I do when I need to let my mind work without my eyes distracting it. Then I drove home and began building a file. I am going to tell you exactly how I verified what I suspected, not because the mechanics are interesting, but because I want you to understand that I didn't act on feeling. I built a case the way I'd built case files for 34 years, documented, dated, sourced, patient as weather. I requested copies of my own credit report going back 4 years, looking for any accounts opened in my name that weren't mine. I found one. A small joint account at a credit union in Columbus where Patrice lived, opened in my name and hers, the kind of account that looks like a convenience arrangement between family members and functions as a deposit vehicle for someone else's money. I photographed the page of the credit report showing that account on my phone. Then I reached out to the financial management firm that had sent the original letter. I explained that I was Raymond Coulter's sister and that I had questions about the distribution records. The woman I spoke to was helpful within the limits of what she could share and referred me to their compliance contact, a careful man named Mr. Ashworth, who, once I had Beverly send a formal inquiry on my behalf, confirmed that correspondence had been received periodically from the beneficiary, meaning me, referencing the arrangement, and in 2 instances requesting adjustments to the monthly amount. He used that word. Adjustments. Upward adjustments. I sat with that for a day. Then I went back to Beverly and told her what I'd found, and she told me that with the joint account, the compliance correspondence, and Raymond's authorization, we had enough to request the endorsement images formally. All we needed was Raymond. Getting to Raymond without going through Patrice required the same kind of lateral thinking I'd applied to difficult cases for 3 decades. You don't go through the wall. You find the door. The wall was built to cover. I called his oldest friend, a retired schoolteacher named Martin Sperry, who'd known Raymond since they were both young men building things with their hands and their weekends. I asked Martin if he would be willing to bring Raymond to a coffee shop where I could meet them, without mentioning it to Patrice first. I told Martin only that I needed to speak with my brother privately about a family matter. Martin, who was 79 and had been watching Patrice run Raymond's life with the quiet discomfort of a man who doesn't interfere unless asked, said he'd have Raymond there on Thursday morning and not to worry about explanations. Raymond walked into that coffee shop with his cap in his hands and his eyes uncertain in the particular way of someone who's been told just enough to know something is coming. I stood up and hugged him and got us both settled before I said a word. I told him slowly and without dramatic emphasis. I showed him the credit report page with the joint account. I showed him the letter from the management firm. I told him that in 4 years, not $1 of his generosity had reached me. He sat with that for a long time. His coffee went cold. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, the way he always reached for things he was proud of, and he produced a letter, 2 pages, folded in thirds, handwritten on cream paper. The kind of paper you'd choose if you wanted something to feel personal and warm. He handed it to me without speaking. It was signed with my name. I have neat, slightly compressed handwriting that Gerald used to say looked like it had been ironed. The handwriting on those 2 pages was loose and generous and not mine in any particular. But it was convincing in the way that forgeries are convincing, when the reader has no reason to doubt. The letter thanked Raymond for increasing the monthly amount. It mentioned that I was looking into a certification program in grief counseling and that his support made that feel possible. It described a garden that sounded vaguely like mine if someone had only seen it once from a distance. I read it twice. Then I set it on the table between us. "That isn't my handwriting, Raymond," I said quietly. "I didn't write that. I have never written to you about money because I didn't know you were sending any." I watched him take that in slowly. The way old grief moves, not fast, not violent, but final. He looked at the letter, he looked at me, he looked at the letter again. Then he said, "She told me you didn't like to call, that you were private about accepting help, that the letters were your way of keeping it dignified." And I understood, hearing that, how perfectly Patrice had read both of us and used what she'd found. My brother's generosity, my lifelong reluctance to ask for anything. She had turned our actual natures into the architecture of her cover. Raymond put his hand flat on the table. His jaw was set in a way I recognized from when we were children, and he'd decided something. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. What I needed from him was his authorization on Beverly's letterhead directed to his bank requesting the endorsement images for every check written to me over 4 years. He signed it at the coffee shop table with Martin as witness, and Beverly filed it that afternoon. Then came the waiting. During the waiting, which lasted 11 days, my life continued with the stubborn, ordinary momentum lives insist on. I weeded the garden. I returned library books. I attended a retirement luncheon for a former colleague and smiled at people across a table and ate chicken that had been kept warm too long. I did not call Patrice. I did not warn her. I did not allow the slightest tremor in the surface of my interactions with her, which consisted during that period of a single group text in the family chain about Raymond's upcoming follow-up cardiology appointment, to which I replied with appropriate concern and a helpful suggestion about parking at the medical center. 12 years of social work teaches you that the most dangerous thing you can do with a person who has been manipulating a situation is to let them know you see it. The moment they know, they start managing your perception of them, and that is a full-time job that leaves no time for the work you actually need to do. So I let her believe whatever she believed about me, which I suspected was not very much. On the 11th day, Beverly called. I was in the garden when my phone rang, and I came inside and washed my hands before I answered it, which tells you something about how I manage anticipation. "The endorsement images have arrived," Beverly said. "All of them. 46 months of checks." She was quiet for a moment. "Every one of them is endorsed in the same hand," she said, "and it matches the handwriting on the letters Raymond shared with us, Marilyn. It's consistent all the way through." I sat down at the kitchen table. "It gets more complicated," Beverly said. "We've had a forensic document examiner look at 3 samples and the joint account records. The checks were deposited by mobile capture. The account is held jointly between Patricia Ann Holbrook and her husband Douglas. The deposits are direct, clean. There's no ambiguity about where the money went." And then she told me the part I hadn't known to look for. "The correspondence file from the management firm," she said. "There are 6 letters in total spanning 3 years. Each one in your name, each one written to maintain the arrangement, and in 2 cases to increase it. The most recent, dated 14 months ago, requests a 6-month advance for a professional development program, a program you were never enrolled in." I looked at the garden through the kitchen window. My tomatoes were coming in red and heavy. The beans needed another week. "That last one," I said carefully. "The advance, was it paid?" A short silence. "Yes," said Beverly. So she wrote to him as me, asked for a lump sum, received it, and he never questioned it because the letters had been building trust for 3 years before she made that ask. I thanked Beverly and told her I'd call her back in an hour. Then I sat in my kitchen with my hands on the table and understood the shape of the thing completely for the first time. This wasn't opportunism. It wasn't even a family loan that had gotten out of hand. It was a designed and managed system, built on forged correspondence, maintained through careful impersonation, and escalated deliberately over time. She had not taken advantage of a moment. She had constructed years. I called Beverly back in 45 minutes. "Here is what I want to do," I said. The occasion assembled itself naturally, which in retrospect I understand was not an accident. My brother's 80th birthday had come and gone, but his oldest friends wanted to mark the occasion properly in the late summer with a dinner at his house, a gathering of people who'd known him for decades. Martin organized it. Patrice inserted herself into the planning, which no one found surprising, and which I certainly didn't discourage. She called me 10 days before the dinner to assign me a task. "Raymond loves your deviled eggs," she said, which was true, and which she used the way someone uses a thing they know is true to establish warmth they don't feel. "Could you bring those and maybe a fruit salad? We want to keep it relaxed." I said I'd love to. Then I asked lightly, almost as an afterthought, who else would be there? She listed 22 names. His old business partners, his neighbors of 30 years, his cardiologist, who was also a personal friend, 2 of his former employees who'd worked with him for decades, people who had known Raymond Coulter, and by extension known me as his sister for the better part of their adult lives. I wrote the list down after we hung up. 22 witnesses. You cannot rewrite what 22 people saw happen at the same table. I called Beverly. I told her the dinner was in 10 days and I needed the document package by then. I also asked her a question I'd been thinking about for 4 days. Is there a way to have someone present at the dinner who could speak formally to what the documents show, if it comes to that? Beverly was quiet. Then she said, "I know someone." His name was Robert Tanaka, and he was a retired assistant district attorney who now consulted on financial fraud cases, and who Beverly described as someone who could explain a forged endorsement to a room of non-lawyers in terms that left no room for reinterpretation. He agreed to attend as Beverly's colleague. He would be introduced as a friend of the family, until he wasn't. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with the document package Beverly had sent and went through it one last time. I had selected 3 checks from the 46, the earliest, the largest, and the most recent, showing the forged Grace Anderson and the account number that belonged to Patrice and Doug. I had one letter, the one requesting the 6-month advance, printed and paper-clipped to the back. Beverly had counseled me the same way I would have counseled a client preparing for a difficult conversation. "Less is more," she said. "A wall of paper looks like a vendetta. 3 checks and a letter look like proof." I had brought enough to make the truth undeniable, not so much that people would look for the angle. I put the folder on the counter. I made dinner. I went to bed at my usual time. I did not sleep well, but I slept. In the morning I made the deviled eggs, which are in fact very good, and I put them in the car, and I drove to my brother's house on a clear August evening with the windows down and the folder on the passenger seat, and 34 years of professional steadiness sitting in my chest like ballast. Raymond's house was lit and full when I arrived, and the sound of people who'd known each other for decades rolled out through the screen door. Warm, crowded, the kind of gathering that reminds you what community used to feel like before everyone retreated to their own screens and their own silence. Patrice was at the door when I came in, radiant in the particular way of a woman who believes she controls the room. She hugged me and exclaimed over the deviled eggs and steered me toward the kitchen with practiced warmth, and I smiled and went and found a place to set things down and looked around the room at the people assembled. Martin caught my eye across the room and gave the smallest nod. He knew a version of what was coming. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. Robert Tanaka was by the window with a glass of iced tea, talking to Raymond's former business partner. To all appearances, he was simply a friend of a friend who'd been included in the evening. Raymond himself found me within 5 minutes, the way he always does, beelining through his own party to put his hand on my arm and look at me with the complicated love of an older brother who knows he didn't protect the people he meant to. "You doing all right, Mary?" His voice was low, just for me. I told him I was fine. I asked him if he was ready. He straightened up and looked across his own dining room at his daughter, who was laughing with someone's wife near the sideboard. His jaw did the thing it had done at the coffee shop. I built this house with honest work, he said. Nothing that happens tonight changes that. I put my hand on his arm. No, I said, it doesn't. We were an hour into the evening. Dessert just arrived, the room at its warmest and most relaxed, when Raymond stood and lifted his glass. He thanked everyone for coming. He made a small joke about turning 80 that got a genuine laugh. He talked about his wife for a moment in the way old men do who are not afraid of tenderness, and half the room had wet eyes. Then he looked down the table at me. I want to say something about my sister, he said, and his voice was steady and clear in the way it gets when Raymond means to be heard. For years now I've believed I was helping her. That she received my help and was grateful, and that we had an understanding between us. A warmth moved around the table, the ambient warmth of a room that expects what's coming to be sweet. I've recently learned, Raymond said, that I was wrong about that, and I want to ask her something I should have asked a long time ago. He looked at me. Marilyn, he said, did you ever receive $1 of what I sent? The room paused in that particular way. Rooms pause when they understand something has shifted. I set down my fork. I looked at my brother across the table, and at the 22 faces turned toward me, and at Patrice, seated 3 places from Raymond's right hand, whose expression had gone from warmly curious to completely, carefully still. No, I said. I never received $1. Not one. A sound moved through the room. Not quite words, not quite silence. Then I reached into the folder that had been beside my chair all evening, and I placed 3 checks on the table in front of me, face up in the candlelight, my brother's handwriting on the front of each, his neat, careful hand, the handwriting of a man who signed his name to things he meant. Pay to the order of Marilyn Voss. Pay to the order of Marilyn Voss. 3 times, 3 months, 3 of 46. Raymond's old business partner leaned forward, squinting. Martin Sperry was very still. The cardiologist had set down his cake fork. I let them look at the fronts for a moment. Then I said, "Could someone turn those over, please?" Martin was closest. He turned the nearest check over with 2 fingers and read what was on the back. On the back was my name, Marilyn Voss, signed in a confident, looping hand that nobody in that room who had known me for 30 years would recognize as mine, and beneath it, a deposit account number. Raymond picked up the second check himself and turned it over. He read the account number aloud, flat, measured. Then he looked at his daughter. "Patrice," he said, "that's your account number." I want to describe what happened next accurately because I've seen people describe scenes like this as explosive, and what I remember is almost the opposite of an explosion. It was a collapse. The careful structure of 4 years of management coming apart floor by floor in a room full of witnesses who had no script for what they were watching. Patrice's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, though not the innocent kind. Calculation. Then something that might have been a genuine flash of fear. Doug, seated 2 places from her, reached for his water glass and didn't drink from it. Then Patrice stood, and what came out of her was not an admission. It was a reframing attempt. She was very good at those. "Daddy," she said, and her voice was aimed straight at the oldest, softest part of Raymond's heart. "Aunt Marilyn doesn't understand. We were managing it for her. She was never going to just accept help. You know how she is. We made it work. The money went where it needed to go to keep the family stable, to keep things running." She was explaining the crime in terms of love. I'd seen that in 34 years of social work, exactly as many times as you'd expect. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ice settling in someone's glass. I spoke then, and I spoke quietly so that the room had to settle further to hear me. "Patrice," I said, "you wrote to my brother in my name. You signed my name to his checks. You asked for more money in my name. I want to ask you one question, and I'd like you to answer it in front of the people in this room who've known both of us for 30 years. I let a moment pass. In what arrangement does one person sign another person's name without their knowledge, and that constitute anything other than forgery?" She opened her mouth. Doug reached over and put his hand on her arm, and she closed it. Robert Tanaka set down his iced tea. He'd been introduced as a friend. Now he spoke as what he actually was, and he did it the way Beverly had promised, mild and precise and utterly without drama. which was exactly why it landed the way it did. What you're looking at on the backs of those checks, he said, his voice carrying easily in the silent room, is a forged endorsement. And the correspondence written in Mrs. Voss's name to obtain escalating payments constitutes, under Ohio statute, a pattern of deception that rises to criminal fraud. These aren't characterizations, they're classifications. The bank records and the document analysis that back them are already on file with the appropriate parties. He let that sit. Forgery. Fraud. He said it the way you'd read a weather forecast. Not to frighten anyone, just to name what the clouds were. Raymond sat down very slowly. He was 80 years old, and he'd just watched his daughter become a stranger inside his own dining room, and there was nothing I could do about the cost of that to him except make sure the truth was visible to everyone at once so he couldn't be talked back into doubt in the morning. That was the whole reason for the room. He turned to me. His voice was rough, but it carried. She wrote to me as you. I know, I said. She asked me for more money, in your voice, yes. He looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked around his own dining room at his oldest friends and his former partners and the people who had watched him build his life. Then he said, quietly but clearly, to Patrice, I need you to leave my house tonight. She left. Doug left. The room absorbed it in that particular way. Rooms absorb things that have no precedent. People finished their dessert in some cases, or stood and spoke quietly in corners, or came and said brief, warm things to me and Raymond that were mostly just presence, because presence was all that was called for. Martin Sperry poured Raymond a small glass of scotch and sat with him for an hour. I sat beside my brother for a while, and neither of us said much. On the drive home, I kept the windows down and the radio off, and I drove through streets where other people's lights were on behind other people's windows, and I thought about the sound a room makes when it stops pretending. What followed was not clean or fast, and I won't pretend it was. The restitution agreement took 5 months to negotiate and was secured against the equity in Patrice and Doug's home and the assets of the small event management business she ran. The criminal investigation moved at the pace criminal investigations move at, which is to say slowly and without sentiment, and it is, as I tell you this story, still ongoing. Forgery and financial fraud by deception are not things that resolve in a season. My brother changed his financial arrangements entirely and immediately. He works now with a fiduciary, a professional with no family relationship to anyone in the chain, and his generosity, which is genuine and has always been genuine, now flows through channels no one can intercept. Some of what was taken has been returned. Not all of it yet. I dropped the coin collection sales. I stopped supplementing the gap and found, to my genuine surprise, that the gap closed on its own once I stopped losing energy to the low hum of financial anxiety that had run under everything for years. That hum is gone now. I didn't notice its absence for 3 weeks, and then one morning I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the garden in the early light and understood that I had not felt that hum in some time and would not feel it again. I don't speak directly with Patrice, not out of bitterness, not to make a statement, but because everything between us now properly belongs to lawyers and restitution schedules and formal correspondence, and that distance is, I have come to understand, simply what honesty costs in certain families. Not a punishment, a correction. I did not cut off my niece. I cut off her access to my name, my silence, and my brother's trust in me, which is not the same thing at all. On my refrigerator, beside a note in Gerald's handwriting that I've kept for 11 years because some things you keep, there is now a photocopy of one canceled check. Face side out, the front visible, my brother's careful signature, the dollar amount, my name as intended recipient. I put it there not to stay angry. Anger is expensive, and I spent too many years of careful budgeting to waste it now. I put it there to stay clear. Because clarity is the only real protection against a world that will occasionally try to tell you that your own life, your own name, your own money belongs to whoever was bold enough to claim it. It doesn't. It never did. 34 years of listening to other people's worst days for a living, and the lesson I keep coming back to is this. The people who take things rarely announce themselves. They build structures, they cultivate trust, they insert themselves helpfully between you and the thing they want. And they count on you being too polite, too proud, or too tired to look closely at what's moving through their hands. Look closely. Ask the question you've been talked out of asking. About money. About who handles things on your behalf. About arrangements you were told were taken care of and never saw the paperwork for. You are allowed to know the specifics of your own life. If someone in your life keeps making that difficult, that's not their love for you. That's information. That's my story. 3 jobs of a different kind, 4 years of silence, and 3 checks turned face down on a table in front of 22 people who couldn't unknow what they'd seen. If this reached someone who needed to hear it tonight, share it with them. Drop a comment and let me know where you are in your own long story. And subscribe, because next time I'll be right here, and it will be worth the stay.